Welcome to the Echo Chamber. We're talking about e-waste, and I'm pleased to say we're joined by a couple of new faces this week. We're following the same format as last week. So, Louis, would you like to get us started?
Yes, that sounds great. So, because this week's topic is e-waste, I began to reflect upon the cell phones, laptops, Nintendo consoles, which I have used but no longer use, and which are lying to waste somewhere around my place. And thinking in these terms, one starts to feel a little guilty about one's own recycling practices. And this is not even beginning to mention the actual problems that arise in the global south. So the point I'm making is e-waste is often framed as a post-consumer problem, meaning that individuals and households are often seen as responsible for it. But I think a really interesting statistic here is that if you live in Europe or North America, 90 to 95% of the waste associated with electronic products arises even before we as consumers buy them. So that is, they arise as industry produces the products. So maybe it would be more productive to speak about the e-waste problem as a problem created by industry. And I think the point I'm trying to make is the way we speak about the problem also frames the solutions we can imagine to it. Yeah, that was my part.
Brilliant, thanks, Louis. April, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thanks. In reading about digital materialism theory, as well as just the realities of e-waste, I was kind of reminded of Judy Wacjman's book, Technofeminism, which I read last semester for understanding technology. But she was very critical of cyberfeminism and cyborg feminism of like the 70s to 90s. And she pointed out that there was this like real divide between the emancipatory metaphors that cyber feminists were using about the internet, like it's this new frontier where gender won't matter and everyone's free from these identity factors, versus the actual power differentials in how technology is produced and consumed. With like women in the global south maybe assembling the mobile phones for very low wages. So it was good to be grounded again in the material realities of technology and how power is often a big question there. I'll stop there before I take too much more time.
Brilliant, thanks, April. Amber, would you like to come in now?
Yes. So I think one theme that underlies this whole conversation about e-waste and maybe even like the larger eco-social growth trilemma situation is the idea of, both human exceptionalism, but also like a technocratic solutionism sort of mindset. First being that like humans have, or they see themselves, we see ourselves as having some dominion over all living creatures, but also over like these non-living creatures like technology that we've created. And Kittler brings up this interesting point in his There Is No Software article. He rejects software as, he rejects the idea that we can disentangle software from hardware. They're kind of a package deal. But he also says that software are the rules by which machine behaviors are governed. So that got me thinking a little bit about, the societies that technology creates, like the societies that they're sort of encapsulated in. And, when we begin to think about software as having like agency or technology as having agency, giving it like some autonomy, I just wonder how we're evading some of these more like troubling downstream effects like e-waste in our human society. That's all.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Amber. I want to talk about the right to repair and the impact that has on e-waste. I think obviously we know the stats are pretty alarming and they're pretty well known, but so are the complaints about firms moving to kind of limit the right to repairs. The consumer culture, repair isn't really in the interest of the firms because they want to make money. But I can just see the massive role the right to repair can play in such a important thing as reducing e-waste. YouTube's full of videos, people repairing technology, eBay's full of the little parts. But I wonder how many people just buy a new device rather than repairing what they have to, because it's just difficult. I've got a subwoofer somewhere that I can't repair. It's probably easily repairable, but the cost of repair is prohibitive and almost as much as getting a new product. So what am I going to do? Repair it for a price or buy a new product that has a warranty? I'm probably going to buy a new one. So I think, Max, your last man standing.
I am, yes. I want to talk a bit about some reflections I have on a seminar that Louis and I attended earlier this semester was on rematerializing the digital. And it's this idea that we often perceive digital technology as virtual, weightless, kind of like non-tangible, when in fact it really builds on very physical infrastructure. And I'm not only talking about phones and laptops here. Like the biggest physical impact is really behind the scenes, not on the screen, right? Like all these big service centers, logistical infrastructure to deliver your Amazon parcel and so on and so forth. And yeah, as I was reflecting a bit on that, I was just wondering, when we think about e-waste, like what is top of the discussion is most of the times consumers' devices. But maybe that's not so applicable. Maybe we should be focusing more on the underlying infrastructure that is controlled by corporations, not only when it comes to like the devices we use, but also like while we use those devices, we watch, for example, YouTube, and 5 billion views equate the energy usage of 40,000 US American homes power consumption. So like, you know, like it's not only like the physical waste, it's also like emissions and stuff like that. So like I think we just like generally need to broaden our scope when we talk about e-waste. It's not only the stuff that's on screen, it's not only the screen, it's also behind the screen, and it's also gases, emissions and stuff like that. Yeah, I guess that's all I want to say in my uneloquent words.
Brilliant, thanks, Max. I don't know if anyone wants to come in with a kind of first response.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there. I think this is like more of a personal reflection, but something that's been freaking me out a lot lately is just like the mass amounts of photos just accumulated on like my phone. And then I've been kind of paralyzed by this like, you know, existential question of like each of these images and each of these pixels represent some kind of data storage, which represents some kind of energy usage. And it's quite daunting, but I think it's only recently that we've been starting to have these conversations of, yeah, like connecting the physical or the physical world to the digital world. And I think it was in one of the readings on digital materialism, and just like where the conversation has been when the digital world kind of came up, it was much more about like the metaphor of what this meant for information and how much more information there would be, without thinking about like what happens when we've actually just accumulated those masses of information. Where do they go? And like, yeah, are they just sitting on our devices? Really freaky. Do you guys feel freaked out by all the data?
I do, because like I think, for example, you know, like Facebook's a great example. I don't want to be on Facebook, but there's photos from when it first started, and that's where the photos are, you know, and they're hosting it somewhere. And actually it's quite alarming to think about what my wider digital footprint. I guess I always thought of my digital footprint as being, you know, I'm sat here, screen in front of me, laptop, there's a phone on the desk, you know, there's various devices around me, and I thought of that as my digital footprint. But I think what you've said, what Max has said, and what Louis said, is just like we need to think wider. And actually, all of us are kind of something. It's quite scary. I'm scared now.
But I really like that you bring up this topic, because maybe some of you guys also feel this, but I don't know. I'm almost like in a fever, or like I feel like I have a need to archive everything that I do digitally. You know, I don't want to lose any of my photos. I don't want to lose any of my old playlists or WhatsApp chats or stuff like this. Even though like irreversibly stuff like this will be lost, even though there's too much to keep track of. Yeah, I mean, I'm going a bit on a tangent here, but I don't know if any of you guys has ever had this kind of feeling too.
Well, I think that ties to, and I'm forgetting the scholar's name. Maybe one of you will remember, but it was like the right to be forgotten, and that kind of idea that was brought up in one of the previous weeks, and just that we as a society are maybe losing the art of forgetting, or the importance of forgetting. And like you're saying, Louis, almost every action we've taken online is archived, and we feel a responsibility to preserve that archive, but where is it going and what is it for?
But again, there, I would really like to mention briefly, like the disparity between the consumer and industry, right? Because while it is very daunting, and like we think about it feverishly, like, you know, like how we archive our own personal pictures, and like those are quite a lot. I don't know, like they're probably in the thousands for each and every single person. However, if we think about stuff like autonomous driving, like autonomous cars archive all the data they collect while driving. Those are terabytes of data collected every single day and archived. In a world where like every car is autonomous, like that is a lot of data stored in the industrial sector again. So here too, I think it's really important to be cautious of like where responsibilities lie and who should be made accountable for those like externalities, I guess.
I think that's an interesting point, Max, when you sort of go away from that emotive sense. I too feel like kind of freaked out about the amount of data that is on me, the amount of things that could be tracked, that my search engines know me better than my partner does, something like that, but at the same time, it's like this separation between when will that information become or have utility, in this idea of what is the data being used for? Is it using to train algorithms that do really important things for us? Like when does that utility and affect separation happen, and when should it happen? Like is there a right time when we can separate our emotions from our data? I don't know.
I think it's interesting you bring in the aspect of utility, and maybe to tie it back to the whole discussion about like waste and e-waste. I don't know, maybe in a sense, or maybe there is a sense to us archiving data with like a back thought of at some point we can recycle this excess data and extract value from it. But yeah, I mean, it's just curious, like how deeply ingrained this like imperative to recycle or archiving things has become. But it's really interesting to bring up like the utility aspect, Amber.
I think it's funny that you talk about, it's not like you can have a yard sale for your data. That would be the classic. You get rid of stuff, like we've all moved houses and you don't take everything with you. But with digital, we're taking everything with us, are we? I don't know. If you stop using an email address, I'm sure my first couple of email addresses when I was younger, I don't use anymore. I assume that data is gone. I don't know. But, physical stuff you keep with you. And, I've probably got my last 3 mobile phones sat in a drawer somewhere. And those will not come with me when I move next time. But you can't have no yard sale for digital data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Have I silenced the group on that one?
That's important.
Has anyone got anything else they'd like to come in on?
I could add another point. Just something that also the readings reminded me of. One of my favorite essays in post-colonial studies is called "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor," and it's by 2 scholars named Tuck and Yang. And it kind of just encourages us to stop using language like decolonize education or like decolonize the internet without understanding that decolonizing pertains to like material reality, as in returning land and natural resources to a people. And I think, that's where I found it kind of analogous with the discussions of the internet that are just completely ungrounded in reality and more about the internet's metaphorical possibilities or metaphorical consequences, even as we're saying, like data's metaphorical consequences around immaterial things like privacy versus the more grounded reality of who is physically impacted and whose land is physically impacted by the internet.
I think if you're somewhere like Iceland, think about it, like Iceland's one of these big data center places now because of the, it's a cold climate. There's relatively cheap electricity available, and that kind of footprint on the place it just isn't always obvious. Like I said, the obvious examples of e-waste to be the things sat around me, but I wonder how many servers are sat, that are old and been replaced. They go in and they change the racks, and what do those things? They just go somewhere. What happens to that waste? What happens to that stuff? Because it's got to end up somewhere. And I remember one of the readings I did, it was talking about the amount of where the e-waste in particular goes, and landfill basically. And it's something like, it said this is like 1% of US waste is e-waste, but 60% of toxic pollution that comes from waste, of toxic waste is e-waste, which is it's alarming, really, to be honest.
Yeah, and especially it was in one of the Wired article that was in the readings as well, noting that there was this like UN convention in 1989 that was like trying to specifically not have like the Western hemisphere's e-waste just run off into developing nations, and it just like didn't work. Like it's just the reality is that yeah, the majority of our e-waste ends up in China, India, and Ghana. So yeah, very disturbing in that sense.
In that sense, I wonder whether it may also be an opportunity that, like what Ben mentioned, like there are certain places that are well, predominantly used, for example, server infrastructure, and whether that could possibly be a good example because, unlike individual devices, server centers are like centrally located, and they're centrally owned. And actually, most of the world's internet infrastructure is today owned by GAFA companies. So you've got companies there that have the material resources. They're like legal owners of those centrally located places. So is that not maybe like a blueprint for like, like people to try out how e-waste must be dealt with going forward?
I think that seems to be bringing ourselves to a close. And obviously, a big thank you to all of you guys for joining me for a good group discussion. If you've been watching, maybe, thanks for coming. This has been our echo chamber. I will be returning, who knows with whom, next week for one more episode. If you'd like to get involved, let me know. I will include details of what people's reading-wise in the description. Thanks for coming.